Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. It's a continuation of this morning's hearing before the Senate Economic Development, Housing, and General Affairs Committee. Some ways, this is a continuation of kinds of issues we dealt with this morning. The legislature is not necessarily always feeling totally up to speed what happens after we go home in May. And this particular issue came to our attention as a result of a 7 days article that the federal government once again has requested either some restrictions or new information or auditing requirements. This time it's the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program that we gave out millions of dollars, I would assume, over the course of 20 and 21. I don't know how long, if it's still ongoing. We'll get some details on that. So we're here this afternoon to learn more about what was in that article and determine whether the department's approach is consistent with what the legislature would like to see and whether we have any other ideas as to how to proceed going forward. But it probably affects thousands of Vermonters, and potentially getting a letter saying that you may owe some money if you don't produce some evidence could be scary to some people. So we want to get some ideas of exactly what's going on and what people are receiving. And we've asked the Director of Unemployment Insurance, Cameron Wood, to come and join us. And with that, I'll turn it over to Cameron.
Yes, sir. For the record, Cameron Wood, Director of Unemployment Insurance Division for the Department of Labor, for purposes of this conversation. I'm happy to help answer any questions that you all may have as far as what's in the 7 days article. I will articulate the reasons why we are asking for this documentation from individuals. I can also speak to why we're doing it somewhat retroactively as opposed to during the program. The PUA program was stood up in the beginning of 2020. As you all remember, it was passed by Congress. It is a federal program, so we have to comply with the federal requirements of the program. It's not a state UI program in the sense that our regular unemployment benefits are controlled in a lot of respects by state law and operation. We have to meet the requirements of the congressional legislation and also federal guidance related to the program. Beginning of the program, when we stood it up in accordance with the guidance as best we knew then to be a self-attestation program. For many of the individuals who file for PUA, they're not eligible for regular unemployment. So for individuals on the call who may not be familiar, to receive unemployment benefits, you have to be attached to the labor market. You have to be a W-2 employee. You have to have enough wages in the system to make you monetarily eligible. That system has inherent checks and balances to validate whether somebody is who they say they are and whether they had employment. We have your wages. We send a separation notice to the employer. They can respond about what the separation is for to make you eligible. For the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, there is no inherent check and balance, either whether somebody has enough wages to make them eligible or whether they even have a job to potentially make them eligible. So at the beginning of the program, it was a self-attestation. You come in, if you're ineligible for UI, you can file a PUA claim. We asked the standard set of questions, what was the job you lost, who was your employer? We asked if you were self-employed or an independent contractor. We let the individuals self-attest to their wages as well. So that went on for calendar year 2020 when UI programs throughout the country were hit with a lot of fraudulent activity based on this program parameter. The federal government, when they instituted the first PUA extension, this was in December, the end of December of 2020, the program was set to expire at the end of that calendar year, and Congress right then at the last minute issued an extension for 13 weeks for the program and then subsequently issued another extension under the ARP. So when they implemented that first extension, they also instituted a requirement that individuals who are receiving PUA benefits must provide documentation to substantiate their employment or self-employment or potential onset of employment or self-employment. That was one of the available eligibility criteria, was if you had a job that you subsequently were not able to work because of COVID. That was in January. The department was not able to implement this provision at that point in time, and we consciously chose not to implement it at that point in time. Because of other priorities that the department had at the time, priorities that we set ourselves in trying to implement these programs. At the same time, if everyone recalls, and not to bring up bad light on the department, but we had the 1099 incident that we were addressing at that point in time. But really, the primary thing is we did not want to implement a requirement in the middle of the program that would potentially shut people's benefits off. The requirement is, again, as I mentioned, the person has to provide documentation about their employment or self-employment. If you read the USDOL guidance, we were supposed to give claimants a certain number of days to comply, and if they did not comply, we were to shut their benefits off and put them in overpayment retroactively. We did not have the staff, we did not have the system capabilities to implement this. And one of the last things we wanted to do was put in a provision in the middle of the program where we would not be able to quickly and efficiently go through the documentations that were provided. You know, we had at that point, I think it was 20,000 individuals filing for PUA. I don't remember the weekly numbers, so we could get that if the committee was interested, or if anybody's listening. You have that information available on our website and we could pull that. But at the time, if we were to implement this, we did not have the resources to be able to answer questions from claimants about what we were actually asking for. And we did not have the resources to be able to go in, and when individuals began to submit documentation back to us, to review them in time to make sure that they did not have their benefits shut off. So we chose at that point, with all of those things ongoing, that we would implement this at a later date, and we would implement it and do a review retroactively. USDOL was aware of this. We were aware of this as a department. We did provide information to claimants that they could provide us with documentation in order to get a higher weekly benefit amount. So I don't want there to be a perception that the department did not make claimants aware that they could provide us documentation and this would allow them to get higher benefits.
Higher than what?
The minimum. The way we set the program up is, because again, the weekly benefit amount in PUA operates similarly to UI. It takes your base period wages and calculates your weekly benefit amount. The difference in PUA versus regular UI is there is a regulatory minimum, if you want to call it that. I was going to call it statutory minimum, but there is a minimum amount of benefits depending on the state, because it's based off of some regular UI data. It's based off average weekly wage, or the average weekly benefit amount in regular UI. Getting very technical here. There is a minimum PUA benefit amount. When we set the program up, we set it up so that individuals would receive the minimum, and we told them that if you want a higher weekly benefit amount based on the self-attested wages that you have given us, because we can't validate those wages because they don't report them to us, you must provide us with documentation validating those wages that you're self-attesting to. If you provide that, we will then recalculate your benefit amount.
What's the minimum? What was the minimum in Vermont?
$190.
190?
Yes, sir.
In regular UI law, there's a variable minimum, isn't there?
Yes, sir. I mean, essentially, I've done the calculation. The minimum amount you can have your weekly benefit amount set in UI is like $80 right now. I think it's something to that effect.
So could you ballpark the percentage of PUA claimants that sent in evidence to get a higher amount? I assume most of those people who were claiming, to the extent they were legitimate claims, probably would qualify for more than $190, but
It was actually, based on the information we have, I believe it was about two-thirds. Two-thirds provided us with some form of documentation that were paid in 2021. Keep in mind, and if I didn't make this clear, and Senator, two-thirds. The documentation provision, the requirement to submit documentation, did not go into effect until 2021, and Congress nor USDOL made us go retroactive to 2020. So the only information we looked at was calendar year 2021. And one thing I will make sure I clarify, because I think I may have misspoke to the article in 7 days you were referencing, Mr. Chair, was we had around, I think it was a little less than 17,000 individuals received PUA benefits in calendar year 2021. And of those, I believe it was around 5,000 had not provided some form of documentation to date. So that's where I'm getting my kind of two-thirds number from.
got it. The federal continuation in December, that basically continued the program. So most of the people presumably were on in the last quarter just had their benefits continued for 13 more weeks. So the separation for most of them from employment would have been prior to 2021, right?
Yes, sir. What we did at the time, we sent a notice to every PUA claimant. This also applied to PEUC claimants as well, those who were on the federal extension and regular UI. And we notified all of them that under the extension, they were provided an additional 13 weeks of benefits. And as long as they, continued to remain and eligible, they could continue to file.
Can you get us, not now, but the letter that you sent out to these 17,000 people?
I can try. Yes, sir.
And documentation is something more than simply a self-assessment.
Yes, sir. So what we are looking at is, and I will say, one thing that we are concerned about, and I'm happy to go into a little more detail about, why we're here, the relationship with USDOL, et cetera, if you would like. In theory, what we would like to see, ideally, is, their tax return, where they're filing with their business, with their business information, their business taxes. We understand that that's not how it always works in every scenario. So we would start with that. If they can't provide us that level of information, we would then like to see something like if they had invoices for work that they had provided. We run into people who truly gig economy workers, if you were a musician, writer, et cetera. So we would ask if they could provide us with some sort of schedule that they had in place where they were anticipating going and playing at X venue or writing for X person during this period, if they had a contract in place. If they can't provide some form of that level of documentation, ultimately we can go off a self-attestation or some form of signed documentation that either they are providing or somebody is providing on their behalf.
So it could be a self-attestation then?
It could be, but we would want to ask more questions if we got to that point, if the person couldn't provide some level of separate documentation that demonstrated that they had a business.
Didn't we pass a law? Damien's here as well, but we passed a law either last year or the year before where we allowed for greater information sharing between you and the tax department?
Yes, sir, we did.
Yes, we did.
Would there be any way to do an interface where they don't have to provide their tax returns?
Oh, that would be
But
great.
you could get the information from the tax department?
That would be so simple.
I cannot speak for the tax department. We did pass language that allowed us some access to the resources that they have in order to validate PUA program eligibility. I would be somewhat leery of simply going and trying to grab their tax information based off the name and social, just because it's not information provided to us by the claimant, and it may not be information that they were using to apply for PUA. If they have multiple businesses, for example, are we grabbing the wrong information? I mean, I'm not saying that is not
I'm thinking
recommendation, but
I'm thinking about if there's 5,000 people who haven't sent in anything, maybe you could filter out half of those by looking at their tax returns. I don't have to bother them. The Department of Labor would say that's enough. They show income from this particular place, and maybe that, I mean, try to minimize the,
yes, sir.
the number of contacts in some ways. But
Something that we have not had a conversation internally about, I'll be honest, but something that I'll take back to the team and see if it makes sense to potentially do that. We'd have to look at the language and make sure the tax department would be willing to share that information. The concern I would have with that too is whether the tax department considers it FTI, federal tax information, if it meets specific criteria and then is defined as such, it has much more restrictions on who they're actually allowed to give it to, what our system's security capabilities are to handle that. So you can go into a very big black hole very quickly. But I do appreciate it.
that's fine. I realize there could be problems, but I would think one of the bigger problems to get over is if you see some earnings from independent consulting or something on the thing, is the Department of Labor say, at that point you've done your due diligence, or are they gonna say, well, what part of the year was this from? Or
right.
is, that somehow you gotta ask more questions than even start. So, I mean, it's another question to ask whether that would help. But I don't need to devise answers here. I'm more concerned for you to continue and go on what the process is. And I'd like to see the communications that go out to claimants at any juncture of this process.
Well, I mean, I just tag onto your thought, which is, I think it's always challenging to claw back what's already been spent, and particularly with this population during the challenges of the last 2 years of COVID. So as much as we would make it easier for Vermonters to not have to go back and do that, if the first filter can be through the tax department, then you're going after people where there's been a red flag, right, rather than everybody. Right. So instead of having to do all that 5,000, it would be great to only do the few that maybe there's really an issue.
Yeah, I think it's a great suggestion.
For your time too, makes you're going to waste less of your time too.
Yes, ma'am. No, I totally agree, and I do want to emphasize, one point here. We emphasized it, or did our best to emphasize it to the reporters that we've spoke with in the past, and to the little bit of the article I've read, I think it came out. Our job here isn't to try to go back and make this unnecessary or unburdensome for people. I know that it will be in some sense. My messaging to the staff have been, it is your job to make sure you're assisting the individual as best that you can. If you reach out and say, hey, we need documentation, the person may not understand what we're looking for. They may not understand what form of documentation, if it's one piece of information, if it's multiple. So I've asked that our staff try to be as empathetic and understanding and cooperative with the claimants that we're reaching out to try to get what we need. On the flip side of that, I do want to acknowledge, there is this program, because of the nature of it, because of the design, was ripe for fraud. And we are looking to go back and find individuals who were not eligible for the program, because there are individuals who meet that criteria. And it is our job in that moment to then try to get that money back.
Are we looking for individuals that we're claiming $190 or something more per week? Or are we looking for real fraudsters, the cyber security kind of things, and people submitting? I know somebody, as you know, submitted a claim under my name, but are we looking for just individuals that Or is it the federal government more concerned with people who are engaging in systemic fraud?
It's both. And I think that it's more difficult for us in Vermont to identify and find the latter, the resources that we have. But I can tell you, there is both. I mean, we've had, as we've done investigations, we've been able to identify certain activities that we thought were more of the latter, kind of systemic, actual, organized attacks on us. But we've also identified individuals who have just fraudulently filed as an individual. I mean, I've been working with the Department of Justice when they come across cases and ask us for information, and we found individuals who they are who they say they are, and they filed in multiple states. There was no identity theft in that instance. It was just somebody who was fraudulently filing, trying to collect as much money. It was 190 would have been the minimum, but keep in mind every week in calendar year 2021, there was the additional $300 FPUC benefit that was extended.
300?
It was 600 initially.
It was originally 600 in 2020. And then if you remember, it expired, then we had LWA,
Right.
and then the legislature authorized the additional $100 a week payment for a month. But when we got to 2021, when the first extension, it was the 300 an additional.
Senator Rahm has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. I'm using headphones in Georgetown, Texas. So just trying to make sure. Hi, Cameron. Good to see you. I first of all just really want to echo and emphasize what the chair said about copying us on these communications. We're often the people who someone might reach out to and say, I don't know what to do. And it was hard to find this out from a 7 Days article and not have a heads up. Maybe I missed it, but that kind of stuff just makes it easier for us to be helpful to our constituents, to in turn be helpful to you. Regarding what I read in the article related to the latest line of discussion, it sounded like you've already recovered some dollars. And I was wondering if you could paint a picture of how much money you've pulled back in, what kind of claimant that was, if you have any demographic information, and then what happens if you get absolutely no response from somebody. Do you simply start opening a case to get the money back? Do you have the ability to garnish their wages in some way? I'm just curious what's help paint a picture of how you're getting money back right now from who, and what happens from people who are kind of buried in communications and don't respond to you.
Sure.
Making a note so I can make sure I respond. Thank you for the question, Senator. I do hear and have documented, making sure that we're providing communication. It's a delicate balance for us. I mean, on the one hand, I will say that, this is standard operating procedure for us in the unemployment insurance division. Now, I understand that PUA is a new program and it involves a separate set of population, but on the regular UI program, for example, we have an entire an entire unit, two actually, a program integrity unit and a benefit accuracy measurement unit. And their job every day is to audit claimants. And we send messaging to claimants every day because we get some sort of information that identifies that they may be ineligible or they may have misreported earnings or something to that effect. So I do want to acknowledge the request of communication, Mr. Chair. I want to acknowledge this is something that you have mentioned in the past. I will also acknowledge here on the record, Representative Sibilia, we had a similar conversation and she made a similar request. So, please know it's just a matter of us trying to figure out when that makes the most sense, for what purposes, et cetera. Senator, to your questions, I will take them in a different order than what you asked. Unfortunately, I do not believe we are going to have any demographic information to share. This is something that we've identified in the past with our UI system as very challenging. We don't collect a lot of demographic information in regular UI. What I don't remember off the top of my head right here is whether or not we started to collect some of that information in the PUA program, specifically male, female, other, race, ethnicity, et cetera. It's not information that we collected for regular UI, and I don't know that it's information that we started to collect for PUA. It is something that we've identified as, a primary benefit and a value for our new modernized system is to be able to identify that information so we can better dig into what are the outcomes for specific individuals and specific populations and how can we potentially make sure that those outcomes are as equitable as possible.
If I could just quickly, you would ostensibly have age though, right? Because you have their birth date. So you would know if there was a preponderance of people in their 60s who are experiencing this.
Correct, Senator. Yes, good point.
Yeah, you have actually, you have their sex, you have their age, you have their location where they live.
We could do age and location. We have testified in the past. We do not feel confident in the information that we have in our system related to gender, or it is sex,
or
it's male, female.
Right.
So quickly back to the other questions. What happens if someone fails to respond? So if you read the guidance issued by US DOL, there are specific timeframes in which individuals had the opportunity to respond. If they were filing by the point in time in which the extension went into place, they were supposed to be given 90 days to provide documentation. If they filed after, I believe it was January 30th or January 31st, they were supposed to be given 28 days to provide documentation. What I can tell you here is that's not how we're approaching it with staff, in the sense that if somebody does not respond to us within the 90-day period, and then they respond on day 100, for example, and they give us the information we need, I'm not interested in administering the program to simply say, you didn't meet the timelines, you're an overpayment, too bad. That's not the exercise that we're trying to go through. So from our purposes, we're trying to get people to respond as quickly as they can. If they do not respond, ultimately, if let's say a year from now, 2 years from now, they just have never responded to us, we are required to put them in overpayment going all the way back to January 1st of 2021. And so one thing I will inform the committee now, for example, one thing I know that will be coming in the future, also in the crowd, I'll mention this for Kelly so she is aware, at some point in the future, we will be sending out overpayment notices to individuals in PUA. Now, I'm concerned about that and the messaging that we need to do leading up to that point, because I imagine it will be some shock to some individuals who haven't received any notice about PUA for a year, and then all of a sudden the department sends them something saying that you're an overpayment. So that is something.
How is it possible that they haven't received anything over the year and they go directly to an overpayment notice if you've reached out in writing and other forms to them about this possibility?
For example, if somebody fails to give us documentation and we find, at some point we have to say you are an overpayment for failure to respond. There are other instances where we've notified claimants that we deem them to be in an overpayment, and we haven't had a full system capable of providing them with all of that information. So that is stuff that we are still, a year after this program has expired, still building out in our system. So,
but it wouldn't be that the overpayment notice is the first time they've heard from the department.
No, sir. But it will be a formal notice saying we have identified that you have overpaid this and you owe us back X, and then that will come with appeal rights. But our biggest concern is making sure they have the information they need to know that it's coming and to understand what it's for.
So we interrupted you in terms of federal government made this a requirement in the extension of the act, and Vermont DOL decided not to do it and put it in abeyance, but you told the Department of Labor, and they gave you they gave you a wink and a nod, or you just said, they said, we can't accept this, and we said, well, we can't do it, and it just got pushed down till, is that the case? It got just pushed down without any agreement with the USDOL?
I would say it's a little more nuanced than that, but in some respects, I mean, and I will answer this question, Mr. Chair, then I'll get back to the recovery
I'm sorry.
that's in around Tennessee I was asking. Throughout the PUA program period, there were specific things that USDOL did not like that we were doing, specific methods of administration of the program. They were notifying us throughout that we were not doing it the way that they wanted us to. Not to go too in the weeds of all these different things, but if you're interested, for example, the way we implemented when I talked about the minimum benefit amount versus the maximum, the way we thought about the program was, we're going to give you the minimum until you give us documentation. The way USDOL wanted us to do it was to implement based on their self-attested wages, tell them they had 21 days to give us documentation. If they didn't, put them in overpayment for the difference. We didn't think that was the best way of implementing it, because when you do that, now all of a sudden on the 28th week, you're putting somebody in overpayment for a specific amount, you're offsetting their benefits without them really understanding why. So there are little subtle nuances to how we administer the program that USDOL throughout was telling us that they did not, that they wanted us to fix. This piece, the documentation piece, was one that we notified them of that we were not able to implement. At that point in time, they were going through a monitoring review of all of the states across the country. And so we knew about it, they knew about it. We had informed them that we had the intention of going back and asking for the information. And so from their purposes, it was, know that we will hold you accountable to doing this. The time frame by which you do it is up to you, state. At the end of the day, there are multiple other retroactive reviews that USDOL wants us to go through. And we have done our best to, from our perspective, push back on them to the benefit of Vermonters to the best that we can. But there are certain provisions or certain things that they want us to do or want us to retroactively review. I'm not quite sure what the conclusion of that is going to be. Our position is we don't feel it appropriate to go back and do some of this work because the program is expired. USDOL expects that we will go back and do certain reviews retroactively on top of what we're identifying here today. I am not sure what the conclusion of that conversation will be. We've communicated in writing multiple times. I'm not sure, we haven't come to a conclusion yet.
But on this particular issue, decided not to take the same tack. You said we're going to comply just when we can.
Yes, sir.
And when did you start complying?
We started reaching out to claimants in the first quarter of this year.
And is the population narrowed to 5,000 from the 17,000 because you have documentation for people already that you paid over $190?
The total population of individuals who received benefits in 2021, because that's kind of where you start, was, like I said, I think it was 17,000.
Right.
I believe we have done over 5,000 reviews at this point. So we're roughly a third of the way through. I think the intent is to go through all 17,000 as long as we have the resource capacity and the funding to do so. If individuals have already provided documentation, it's much easier. You know, you can review what's provided, and if we feel that that's sufficient, then we can move on. We have no reason to reach out to them whatsoever. It's the individuals who have provided nothing to date that, you know, we must reach out to.
So that, sorry, Cameron, I thought you said that was 5,000.
Yes, ma'am, I believe it's
of the
approximately
17,000.
So
But the 5,000 that we have completed is not necessarily the 5,000 that have not provided documentation to date.
So I guess my question is, I thought 12,000 had provided documentation. Your testimony implied that there were only 5,000 that hadn't. So why do you need to go to the 12,000 who had provided the documentation?
To make sure that it's sufficient for their eligibility.
And of the 12,000 who have complied, how many of those have you reviewed?
I
The
do not,
finalization, any idea?
I do not have that answer right here, Senator.
Do you have an
I can-
approximation?
I did not ask that question of my team before I got here, so no, sir, I would be totally speculating.
is the information provided by the 12,000, is that different than the information you're asking for now, for instance, from people who haven't supplied anything?
No, sir, it would be the same. We would review what they provided. I mean, you know, I want to be clear. I mean, there are many people who were eligible and need to simply provide us with something so we can move forward. There are many people who were eligible that provided us exactly what we needed. There are also claimants who provided us with falsified documentation, and you can clearly tell it's false when you get to the point of actually being able to sit down and review it. So,
Do you have any statistics as to the results of your review today?
I have information for our regular UI program. What I don't have are the details about our PUA program, about this review. So like I can talk to you about what our improper payment rate is, et cetera, for UI. I don't have that information available to share for PUA at this point. No,
Is
sir.
that something that you provide us separately after this meeting?
Yes, sir. It was something that we were hoping to have completed throughout this, you know, we just started this, you know, just 6 months ago. And so it's something that we were hoping to be able to provide in the coming months as a total. Here's what we've reviewed, all PUA claims. Here's what we've identified as potentially fraudulent. Here's what we've identified as overpayment, et cetera. It's information that we don't have available to share right now.
So of the 5,000 that you've reviewed, if there is sufficient information to meet the requirements of DOL, that claimant doesn't receive any information from you? You don't talk to that claimant at all?
Yes, sir.
And if there's no information in the file, is there a standard letter that goes out?
Yes, sir. It's an email communication coming from our staff.
Okay, do we get a copy of that too? And if there's insufficient evidence or you have reason to believe it's fraudulent, is that a different letter or email that goes out?
It depends on the circumstance. So for example, if we've identified that somebody has filed a fraudulent claim, you're okay with me using you as an example, Mr. Chair? I mean, we don't necessarily notify the person that we've identified it as fraud. If we're able to catch it beforehand, for example, we know, we withdraw it, we move on. So we're not, you know, we don't have any interest in communicating with somebody we know is filing fraudulently.
And the absence of criminal penalty in the statute continues to apply, so we do nothing about it.
We put them in over, depending on what the fraud is, yes, sir. If it's an identity theft claim, you know, for example, if somebody filed using my name and my address, I mean, that's how we were turned on to a lot of the fraudulent activity. Somebody would call and say, I received this in the mail, I didn't file for unemployment. At that point, there's very limited amount of information we can go off of to try to find the person who perpetuated the fraud. One thing we can try to do is try to take bank account information and go from there. But in a lot of instances, a lot of the fraudsters will use prepaid debit card banking information, for example, and it becomes very, very difficult to track them once the money is out the door.
How much money are we talking about here in all? You have a calculation of the total amount of fraud that you've identified in this fashion.
I can talk to you about the estimated improper payment rate for the regular UI program. What I don't have right now is the total amount that we paid out to date in identity theft fraud.
You mean to
Not
say we
prepared to
have
give that
had
information.
identity theft fraud that's been going on for months and the department has no idea how much money is involved? Is that what I'm hearing?
What I'm not prepared to give you is the amount that has been paid out because it would not be, in our opinion, an accurate estimation of what we know to date. So
I'm sorry, I don't understand that answer. Cameron, maybe you can rephrase it, but I don't get that answer at all.
So a regular UI program, all I can give you is our improper payment rate information, which is based off sampling that our team does. So they take a sample of cases, they review it, they estimate what our improper payment rate is, and they estimate what the overpayment based on that improper payment rate is. So I can give you that number right now. We don't have a similar mechanism in place to review PUA claims because it's a brand new program. USDOL, for example, right now is they are doing work. Our team went to a review a month ago and provided sample cases to review. USDOL is trying to come up with what they believe is an improper payment rate for the nation, for PUA. Separate from that, because improper payment is going to include everything from just regular overpayments to
Errors,
fraud to identity theft, because two types of fraud, right?
Errors.
Identity theft and people who are, they already say there's fraudulent filing. What we are trying to do is go through and be able to document all of the cases of identity theft that we have been able to ascertain to date.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you that that number is in the thousands to date. It's not in the tens of thousands.
People or dollars?
People. What I don't have prepared to share today, because I don't want to give you a number without being able to provide context to that number. So it is information that we are trying to compile, and I would like to be able to provide it to you with additional context about here's how many we've identified, here's how many we've paid out, here's how much we've paid out, here's how much we've prevented, et cetera.
At what point will you be able to give us those statistics?
My intention was to be able to provide it to you by the end of the year, beginning of next session. That was our goal. Yes, sir. Because we are, keep in mind, this is why you asked me to come here. We are reviewing claims. So,
But I realize that by the end of the year, you may not have completed given the volume that you have, but of what you have thus far, is not there any statistic maintained as to how many cases of identity theft you've identified and how much money is involved?
I do not have the number right now.
Does anybody have that number that can be provided to us timely?
I will go back, I will ask our team to try to pull together as best information as we can, and we will do our best to get it to you as quickly as possible.
The question sort of seems obvious. I could understand Senator Bruck's concern, because as you resolve a case, it goes into a column somewhere. This one is clean, this one's not, this one was that. Someone's got to be keeping track of the cumulative total as a running total of that, I would assume. Or you're going to go back to each individual file at the end and then start adding them up. I mean, it doesn't make.
So the challenge here is, I will start by saying I totally understand the question. Please understand that.
Okay.
I totally respect the question. It's information that you need to be able to provide. It's not, when you actually get to administering this, it's not that simple, in the sense that, for example, the department's never had a fraud team before because we've never experienced this type of fraudulent activity. Our systems do not communicate effectively together. We've had to basically design all of this from scratch within the past 12 months. So what we're doing is we're having to pull information from multiple different systems. When we identify something as fraudulent, we then don't have the technology to be able to just generate that, spit it on a report, and give you a number. So our team is working to try to pull all of this information together. Keep in mind, it's coming from the mainframe, it's coming from the LWA program, it's coming from the STS program, and it's coming from PUA. We're trying to pull all of that information together, document it into a repository, and then go through and review it for accuracy. it takes time to go through that exercise. And meanwhile, we're trying to do our best to keep any new fraud from coming in the door. We've testified to this many times over the past 2 legislative sessions. Our priority has always been prohibiting fraud from happening as opposed to going back, trying to review, document, identify, clean up. We understand the need for that and the priority for that. But at this point, it's information that we will and we intend to provide and we need to provide. But at this point, the information is not changing. It's a matter of identifying it and getting it into a format that is then
I guess
easily understood and communicated.
I'm coming at it from a perspective. I feel like, on one hand, it seems like a monumental task. I'm not sure what it's going to yield to Vermont other than appeasing the feds. I want to get an idea of how much money we're getting back and how. But I'm most concerned about the negative impact, and I know you've said that you had share some of these concerns of the innocent people who did nothing wrong here and now know what to make of this. And is this all worth the effort? And that gets me to the question of, are other states in the same situation as we are?
Yes, sir. Other states are in different places respective to how much retroactive work that they have. But,
I guess I'm trying to get at, has any state said no to the feds on this one, like it sounds like you've done on a few other elements where you're refusing to go along because you think it's somewhat unreasonable?
I can assure the committee that our department has taken a very strong position with USDOL as far as all of the retroactive work that they have been asking us to go back and do. From our perspective, there is a level of recognizing through audits, here are things that we did not do correctly, or here are things that we did not administer the exact way we were supposed to. However, to then go back and try to put people into overpayment and potentially deal with the consequence of that for the individual and then the overpayment waiver aspect, et cetera, it is an administrative burden that we are not interested in going down. We have tried to work with USDOL and meet them a little bit in the middle, which is why we're going through this exercise that we are with PUA claimants for documentation review. One thing USDOL will come in and say is you shall do this because it's their money that paid for a lot of these benefits and they want those overpayments identified and recovered if possible. So it's difficult to come in and answer a question of, well, how much did you overpay if we're going to say, well, we're not even going to go back and review because it's a waste of time. And so there's a little bit of, we are trying to work with USDOL. We are trying our best to go back and review these different programs so we can help identify these, this information that is important to have. There is also aspects where, as I've told you, we have told USDOL we are not interested in going through certain exercises that they've asked us to do. We were at a UI committee meeting with our national association, NASWA, just a few weeks ago at our annual conference in Chicago. At our UI committee meeting, USDOL was there. They were talking to us, and I can tell you that I, for one, in particular, stood up in that meeting and said, we need clear understanding from USDOL about what their expectations are with some of this work because we do not have the staff and the resource capacity to go back and do some of this. My priority is to try to work and identify fraud, not to go back to all of these individuals that may have been paid in the wrong program and put them in overpayment and move them to a different program. USDOL is going to come in and say, that's what you have to do. And so there are other states that are in a similar position as we are. I've spoken with a few of them. I think that we as a department have identified some next steps that we would like to take to USDOL to further this conversation. Keep in mind there were 6 different programs that we were administering. USDOL wants us to account for just about everything in these programs. from our perspective, we don't want to take actual Vermonters and have to put them in overpayment and move them to different programs and deal with the administrative burden for us and deal with the emotional consequences and toll that has on the claimant. We would prefer to focus on the fraud and being able to identify it, document it, and recover it. So a little bit of we have to meet them in the middle. And again, I don't know where that's going to go as far as what the next steps are. I asked USDOL in the meeting directly, what happens when a state tells you, no, we will not do this? And they would not answer my question.
And overpay.
Then legislation passed in Congress relieving the states that didn't comply of any burden, and then all the work that you did, being the good soldier, gets paid for by somebody. So have you sent any dollars to the feds on repayment from the PUA program for overpayments?
Yes, sir. It's not in the sense of we wait and then sign a check to them and send it over. For example, in
It's
the
offset somehow?
it'll get offset and then it'll be accounted for in the back end, and we will identify money and put it in the appropriate account in our federal treasury account and account for it in that sense.
But there have been hundreds of cases already that you've identified where
I pulled, so again, here's the struggle that I'm in sitting in this chair trying to answer the questions that you have. We have certain information for regular UI. I don't have the same information for PUA.
This whole issue before us is just about PUA right now, right?
And I'm here to tell you, when you look at, so the PUA system operates as a mini UI program.
Right.
There are certain functions that we don't do. We don't have an employer side. We don't have a BAM, when I was talking about the improper payment measure, how we calculate that. We don't have that. But when you talk about the nuts and bolts of the system, what the system needs to do, it's basically a miniature UI program. We've talked about how long it takes to design and implement a UI modernization system. We talked about that being years. So there are many aspects of our PUA system that we have not developed because it takes time to do these things. And it's only been 2 years, not even 3 years, since we've had to operate this program. So there are certain reporting aspects that we don't have in place. We as a department have done a lot over this past year to try to get that stuff developed. Unfortunately, we just haven't been able to get across the finish line yet.
How long did the PUA program last until?
We took the first claims in March of 2020, and it expired in September of 2021.
I still go back to just fundamental questions about fraud, accounting, and accounting for fraud. Just questions like, how many cases of identity theft have there been that you discovered?
So far, I believe it is around 6,100 cases.
All right, and of those cases, what have you done with them?
In most instances, if we find it before it's actually paid out, we do nothing with it.
All right, and after it's been paid out?
We provide that information to. For PUA, they sit. We have not been able to go after any recovery efforts because, again, we still need system functionality to be able to do that.
You've discovered them to begin with, right?
We have not discovered all of them, no, sir.
Well, the 6,000 you say that you've discovered, right?
Yes, sir.
So you have some information about each of those 6,000 cases.
Yes, sir.
Where the money went, to whom?
In some sense, yes, sir.
I mean, in order to get a check, they have to get a check. It has to be mailed someplace.
Yes, sir.
And you have an address.
Yes, sir.
And who have you sent that to attempt to recover anything?
We have provided our claims information to the U.S. Department of Labor, OIG. Outside of that, there's not much that we can do as a state of Vermont, especially if it's not a state of Vermont address. And if it's...
Well, of the 6,000 items, they have been sent somewhere. And so presumably, irrespective of the absence of criminal penalty and that's been devoid in our statute, that is still a fraud and a theft under other Vermont statutes, isn't it? Has this ever been reported to any law enforcement agency
I would
as a
not,
fraud?
I would not be the best to speak to your question. We have somewhat worked with the Vermont State Police. There's limited ability for them to go after actors that aren't here in the state of Vermont. They don't have the resources to be able to tackle this type of activity. And frankly, most states don't. I don't have the staff to be able to spend time trying to track these people down, nor do I think they have the technology capabilities or jurisdiction or, law enforcement blessing to be able to do so. And
But we did this extensive fraud analysis using a consultant based on some, is there anything resulting from that would help you in this situation in terms of recommendations to implement or to ask us to impose a law, create a law?
To me, it would be a question about whether or not we are trying to, are there things that we want to implement to try to prevent fraud from happening in the future, or are things that we want to do to go after fraudulent actors that we've been able to identify during this pandemic? If it's the former, I think there are conversations that we can have about things that we can build upon that we're already doing that will allow us to ensure that fraudulent actors are identified as quickly as possible coming in the door. If it's the latter, I don't think that's what the report was really designed to look at. And I think
that's a question of what some of us in the legislature asked for and what we got, which was very different.
Sure.
But what you're saying, if I understand what you're saying, is that if you can prevent a fraud, you can save that money from going out the door.
Yes.
But once 6,000 people steal thousands of dollars from the taxpayers, whether it be federal or Vermont, they're home free because it's consequence free, is what you're saying. And that you're not going to do anything to try to recover it.
There is limited ability that we as a Department of Labor have to go after those individuals.
What about USDOL? What do they do to go
That's
after?
why we've provided them that information. But then it's going to be up to them and USDOL and the OIG at USDOL and the Justice Department to be able to use their resources to do an investigation and then determine whether they want to bring a case.
Have you asked them what they're doing with this information?
We've had conversations about it. I haven't asked them specifically of what they're doing with our information, Vermont. No, sir. I just want to emphasize this point real quick, Mr. Chairman. I understand your frustration and I share it, but I don't have the staff or the resource capacity to go after this type of activity.
Yeah.
It's not what we as a Department of Labor have the authority, funding, jurisdiction to do. And I would say, I can't speak for the Vermont State Police, but, you can ask them, but I imagine they're going to be in a similar boat.
Have you reported each of these 6,000 cases to the Vermont State Police or to any other law enforcement agency?
No, sir, not to the Vermont State Police, no.
But to USDOL?
Yes, ma'am.
Who are charged with the enforcement of this, I assume.
Yes, ma'am.
So I don't quite, I guess I'm asking the same question Senator Brock asked. Gone through 5,000 cases, found some identity theft, some fraud, some overpayment, and you say that you've collected some reimbursement from the overpayment. Can you go back to the office and send us information of how much money you've collected? And this sounds very labor intensive, and it doesn't sound like you're getting your money's worth, and maybe you're only doing it because the Department of Labor is forcing you to do it. But so it doesn't make any sense if they're not going to repay the money. A lot of the people won't understand this, won't feel like they're obligated because they weren't asked for this information when they got their checks. You're going to be spending more on administrative dollars than the amount of dollars that you collect
Anything
back.
we reclaim.
Well, I'd also just like to talk a little bit about the internal controls. If you set out 6,000 checks on the basis of fraudulent identity, how did that fraud occur? In other words, how did someone create a fraudulent identity to cause you to send a check to someplace other than it should have been sent?
Two things. I think we can go back, I can ask the question, whether or not we can identify how much in PUA overpayments we have recovered to date. Keep in mind that the number is likely going to stem from offsets that we did during the program. It's not going to stem from us sending out bills and collection notices and, intercepting taxes, et cetera. So
You mean, so they were laid off in a future place and they had an offset to a future claim?
it would have been offset during the program's existence. Like, we're not offsetting UI benefits to pay PUA overpayments at this point in time.
What are you offsetting the PUA overpayments against?
If we put someone in overpayment during the program and we offset their weekly benefit amounts until the end of the program,
I would assume they weren't eligible for those future benefits either if they were fraud.
it depends. If somebody gave us the wrong information that established their weekly benefit amount, for example, or if we ascertained that there were just certain weeks they were not eligible.
Well, some pages ago, you mentioned the substantial number of these cases were identity thefts. So it's not an employee who
Right.
put in an incorrect amount
Right.
of their income. This is a clear fraud. Someone
So-
is using a fraudulent identity. And so my question is, how were they able? What was the mechanism that they used to convince you that they were the person who was entitled to something? Or did they create an identity out of whole cloth that you paid on?
So to talk about the checks and balances, and I want to make sure I'm absolutely clear for the record. Like, this is my concern that I have with sharing a number with you like 6,000, because I don't have the context in front of me right now about that 6,000.
Understood.
Some of that 6,000 were not paid out. That 6,000 number right now includes both claims that were paid and claims that were prevented.
Right. That were caught. So
I don't have also the breakdown of how many of those 6,000 were PUA versus regular UI, for example. So there's a lot of context here that
Does somebody
would
in the
like to
department
provide.
have those numbers that you can get at after this meeting today?
I will go back and no one other than I would have them
Okay.
before I would have them, if that makes sense.
So does that mean that the numbers don't exist? That there's been no calculation of adding, how many cases of fraudulent identity have you had and how much money have you paid out to date on it?
I will go back and talk with the team and provide you information as soon as I can. My concern is the information has to be properly vetted before I'm willing to turn it over. And so I will go back and talk with them. When you talk about controls, the first control that we have in place, most of the controls are inherent to the regular UI system, not the PUA system, and I'll talk about why. When someone files for unemployment benefits, whether they were intending to get to PUA or not, they file their initial UI application. They provide us with their social security number, they provide us with their separating employer, etc. First two checks and balances in the system are, if they provide us with the address, their address, we send a notice to them telling them you've applied, here's your monetary benefit amount. They provide us with the separating employer, we send a notice to the employer. In a lot of instances, that's actually where we tackled the issue, because the individual, when we see true identity theft, the fraudster has all of your information. Name, social, driver's license number, date of birth, address, everything. So traditional, we did a cross match with DMV. We asked people to provide us with their driver's license number so we could do a cross match with DMV to provide individuals who didn't match. Most of the fraudsters have that information, they get through. They, in most instances, put the person's actual address in. So that's where I was saying a second ago, hopefully the first check and balance. We send you a notice, you get it, you call us, I didn't file for unemployment. Right then we stop the claim. If the employer notices us that the person didn't separate, for example, we're able to put a stop on the claim right there. The other check and balance that we were able to put into place during the pandemic, not at the beginning of the pandemic, but during the pandemic, was a cross match with this national association that you've heard us talk about before, NASWA. They have what is called an integrity data hub, and they compile information from all states about suspicious information, IP address, names that are used, phone numbers, addresses, etc., bank account information. We cross-match with that. So anytime information comes back from there that we think is suspicious, we can stop a claim and look at it. Some of those checks and balances were not able to be put in place until halfway through the pandemic, if not more than halfway, because we didn't experience these types of attacks prior to the pandemic. That's how a lot of individuals were able to get through. In the PUA program, there's not a similar type of inherent checks and balances because we designed it very quickly, and we designed it to try to be as, so what do I want to use here? Electronic communication as opposed to physical documentation. So we were asking people for email addresses, etc. So if there you've lost the first check and balance right there. Fraudster comes in using my stolen identity, but puts a different email address on there, and we send the communication to the email address and not the address on file, we've lost the check and balance for that's in the UI system. The reality is it's still there because you have to file for UI before you file for PUA. So there are checks and balances built in, but I can't emphasize enough that this program was designed as a self-attestation program with very little forethought into what was going to actually happen during the pandemic, which is what got us to this documentation requirement in the first place. Congress said, we've seen how much fraudulent activity is coming through the system in 2020. We want to change that.
Right. Hence the beginning of the additional documentation, right. Hence the beginning of.
So outside of doing as much cross-match activity as we can, which we do, if somebody has all of the stolen information and everything checks out and the employer's not participating if there is one, or the potential individual with the stolen identity isn't participating if there is one, sometimes there's little that we can do. If you provide us with all of the right information, you are who you say that you are to us, unless we start requiring everyone to come in and provide proof of their identity to a Department of Labor office. So
at what point do you determine that a fraudulent claim has been filed? How do you determine that?
Right. And it's a fine line if you're also looking at overpayment, because overpayment is not fraud necessarily.
Not always, correct.
We're just talking here though about fraud. I just want to have an understanding of how do you understand that fraud has in fact occurred?
In most instances, throughout the past 12 months, 12, 14, 16 months, since we've gotten a lot of these cross matches put in place during the latter half of the pandemic, in most instances, I'd say we're able to identify it relatively early. So during the pandemic, another thing that we were doing that I failed to mention there was we had staff as best we could with the resources that we had going through claims that were filed every single day. We were looking at all of the information that was provided. We were looking at if the separating employer was suspicious. We started to notice that fraudsters were selecting the same separating employer. So we got tipped off there. If we had suspicion about the email address that was provided, for example, fraudsters will hit you in the same instance and use just some sort of, cadence of email address or sequence. So if there's any type of cross-match hit that we get that makes it suspicious, again, if you don't provide us with the DMV, the cross-match comes back as negative. If we get something back from NASWA's suspicious actor repository that identifies a claim potentially as suspicious, if somebody notices us, whether it's a claimant or an employer, that somebody's filed in their name or somebody shouldn't be filing, all of those things, we will immediately put a flag on the claim. We will stop. We will reach out to the claimant and say they cannot continue to be paid unless they provide us with proof of their identity. So, I would say at this point, I'm pretty confident that we are able to stop all of the fraudulent activity that's coming through. But another thing that we did during the pandemic, if you guys recall, we had to put our initial claim online because we couldn't manage the incoming call volume.
Mhm.
We took that down because we noticed that our systems were getting hit. We were getting 1,000 claims a day, and 99% of them,
They were suspicious
90% of them we were identifying
Right.
as suspicious and fraudulent and stopping from going through. And so then we determined, working with ADS and their security folks, that that was vulnerable. It was a vulnerable point of entry. And so we took it down and we forced people to start calling us again, which is a very inefficient way to file claims if you're trying to attack someone's system. So,
And did that have the effect of reducing the number of suspicious claims?
immediately. Yes.
Are you still
Yeah.
doing that?
Yes, sir. Everything I've described is current activity. I mean, I am confident at this point in time that we are prohibiting 99% of the fraud that's coming through the door. There is very little instances now in this case where we're getting information from claimants about, I received this notice, I didn't file a claim, etc.
Was there any pattern to where the money was being sent?
No, sir, not that I was aware of or made aware of during the pandemic. As we are continuing to build out the information that we have about the fraud claims we've identified, we will take a look at that, but it's not something that we were able to identify in the moment.
And in terms of your notification to DOL, the U.S. DOL's Inspector General, when you send them information about question payment, particularly one that you believe is fraudulent, you send them all of the details, such as the trail of the money.
We have sent you, yes, sir. To answer your question, yes, sir. We have sent them, US DOL OIG has asked for information on every claim that's filed during the pandemic from every state so they can do their own data analysis on that information. So the US government is really the one in the best position to be able to go after some of this fraud that has occurred, because they're the ones with the tools, the jurisdiction, the resources, et cetera. When we identify it, share it with them, yes, sir, we do give them all of the information available.
So let me just move off of fraud for a second and move to, I think what the PUA program was primarily about. People who didn't necessarily qualify for unemployment or were facing lack of work, lack of wages, lack of resources to get through the pandemic. So let's take a housekeeper. She's making a small amount. She or he has 5 or 6 small jobs, and because of COVID, she can't go into the house. He or she can't go into the house anymore. Or maybe she could make it easier. Let's assume she or he has one employer and goes in there a few days a week. Then she's told she doesn't have to provide any information in order to collect this. She does. She collects $190, let's say, a week. And then 2 years later, she gets a letter from the department. We need verification that you actually worked there. This person's moved out. She can't get it. What do you do at that point?
If I were speaking with the claimant,
You what?
if I were speaking with the claimant, my first question to them would be, based on the facts that you've given us, your business is that you were working for a single individual providing housekeeping services. You were not able to go in there during the pandemic. Do you file taxes and use that as an income? Do you have a business name? I'm assuming potentially no. Okay. Do you file taxes and list that as your income and list that as your occupation, et cetera? Okay. Can we start there? If not there, again, do you have a business name? Do you advertise? Nope, you're working with one person. Okay. Are you still communicating with that person? And can we get some sort of documentation from them that that was your employment? If we can't get any of those circumstances to to match, we could land with, we need you as an individual to provide us with an affidavit that these are your circumstances and here's why you can't produce this level of documentation, and we would go from there.
So bottom line is people who may not have the skills or the connections or the ability to do this, an affidavit, an attestation may be sufficient.
Yes,
in the end.
we have provided that information on our website. We did add, so one thing we have received is people who are concerned of whether or not it's even the Department of Labor that are reaching out to them. So we have put, you go on our website, you click unemployment insurance, it's the first thing, second piece of information, but it's at the top that says, we are doing this, and here's a click here for information, and we put on there that an attest or an affidavit is potentially sufficient.
Okay, I think this would be a good point to take a break in here from Kelly.
Right.
Because I assume these are the folks that she might be most concerned about, that we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater here in an effort to put a lot of administration dollars to get to fraudulent claims, and at the same time, we may be intimidating the average innocent Vermonter. So Kelly, why don't you come up and share with us what your thinking on this whole situation?
Thank you. So good afternoon. For the record, I'm Kelly Kazmarski, staff attorney at Vermont Legal Aid. I do have some prepared comments that I did want to present to the committee, but first I'd like to address some of the discussion that's already happened here, if you don't mind, particularly on the issue of the PUA overpayment issue that is likely to come down the pike, so to speak. We've been hearing about this review. The Department of Labor is being required to go back and audit and request additional documentation from folks. And I think Cameron testified that eventually there will be PUA overpayment notices that will be issued. Some of the folks are not able to provide documentation that will result for some people in overpayment notices. It's our understanding that the department does not yet have the capability of generating overpayment notices for PUA. We are seeing folks who are being told that their eligibility is being questioned, for example, and there are hearings being held on the issue of whether a person was eligible for PUA. Though I have a colleague at Legal Aid who is has a few clients dealing with this. They go through this proceeding. The conclusion of the proceeding with the ALJ may be that in fact you were not eligible for PUA, but that's where it sits right now. My colleagues' clients are not aware actually that this will result in an overpayment notice. So the question was asked earlier, when the notices are issued, that won't be the first time folks are aware of the overpayment. And I'm afraid that there are going to be people who have actually gone through even proceedings that are not aware. They have seen this issue framed as one of eligibility, not understanding that when you're found not eligible, that means you were overpaid benefits. So I think this is going to be a big issue when the when the department has the ability to issue the overpayment notices. And that's another concern. There is no statute of limitations for PUA overpayments like there are for state UI overpayments. And we are concerned that it could be several years down the road when folks are faced with notices saying, guess what, you were overpaid back in 2020 or 2021 with this PUA. So it is a big concern of ours.
Just some examples of players that you've seen as to why they would be in the situation of having to potentially overpay something. How did they get to where they are?
That why they've been overpaid? Is that
Or why, yeah.
Or ineligible.
Yes.
Were ineligible. Okay. I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but I can imagine a situation that you were speaking about earlier, for example, where someone did some very part-time work that they are not actually able to document. But they did legitimately do work, and according to the rules of the program, would have been eligible for PUA were they able to provide the documentation. But as the senator said earlier, for some of these folks in the gig economy who did work a couple of years ago, they have no ability to go back and provide documentation of that work. So that's one example that comes to mind. I'm sure my colleagues would have other examples I could provide you. But we have testified before that it's our position that fraud is actually a smaller percentage of these overpayments. We believe that mistakes perhaps were made in how income was reported, what kinds of income was reported, but that is different from fraud, which requires an intent. In fact, the department does provide information to the USDOL about improper payments, as Cameron said, and has had that information in the regular UI program. We requested some of that information this year, and at the end of 2021, the department was reporting, if I can just find my page here, that there were approximately 1,290 total cases of overpayments established at the end of 2021 in the regular UI program. And of those, only 86 were fraud. 1,204 were non-fraud overpayments.
Or just straightforward overpayments.
Mistakes made, people, the rules are complicated in terms of especially reporting income. And folks make mistakes. It's a genuine mistake, though. It's not fraud.
Right.
But they still do lead to an overpayment. That's why we do believe that the vast majority of overpayments will be, are more the non-fraud type. That's our experience with legal aid.
But isn't there a distinction between PUA and the regular program? I mean, it seems like PUA is more ripe fraud than the regular program. There's less checks in terms of, you don't have an attachment to the workforce. There's generally no communication with your employer. So,
and certainly, I was listening to the checks and balance discussion, and it definitely does seem with the electronic communication, right, it is certainly more right for fraud. But again, it's our experience. Certainly, I would say almost 100% of the overpayment cases that we've seen come through legal aid are not fraud situations.
Does it give you any solace, for lack of a better word, that the department says on its webpage, or it gives me some, not a great deal, I have to say, that the bottom line is if the claimant comes up empty-handed, they can always attest. And I assume, unless that attestation is really off the wall, that will be accepted. But having worked with these claimants myself personally, just the whole process is going to be intimidating and hard to keep up with. And I can see them not even getting to the attestation stage or disregarding everything. And now they have a black mark on their record. And, I don't know if there's possible collections other than offsets of these overpayments.
Well, and that, to go back to your point earlier, Michael, I think that is why the first run through the tax department would be a great partnership to prevent as much angst and just sort of general trauma around this, or where there already is so much. And to do that first cut, so that we don't even have to involve the individuals, and only the ones where there are red flags that come up as a result of the tax department DOL.
Right. And I'm sure, Cameron, I sound like a broken record here, but one of the reasons I want to see these communications is it's not only your department, but your department does have a record of sending these notices out in bureaucratic language. And I've known that we've had several instances, I think, maybe in the healthcare arena or the healthcare advocate, where you compare notes with them in terms of what is said so that it's communicating in a way that doesn't alarm them as much. So that's why I'd like to see those letters.
Well, the one thing I look at is the website from DOL, which says in the event you have not provided documentation and you do not respond to the department's request for information, here it says in all caps, you will be placed in overpayment for all benefits received in calendar year 2021. That seemed pretty clear to me.
Yeah, where's
Now,
where's the attestation?
Well, it describes pieces of attestation as to what is acceptable for people who are self-employed and so on. And the question, of course, is did all of these claimants who received PUA, did they get that? And presumably they did. It's other than just in the website. Right? You mentioned that you reached out to those folks. Is that my understanding
I
correct?
think it was by email. Cameron said that they were contacted, and that is also a concern that we have at Legal Aid, that there are still plenty of folks who do not regularly use email, don't have email accounts. So if that's the only way that the department is reaching out to request this additional information, I fear, as you said earlier, Senator, that folks are going to won't even realize what is happening and the status that they've been placed in.
We call them as well. Just to clarify on that point real quick, we send an email. We do actually call them as well with the number that they provided to us. We try our best to make two different types of communication to claimants.
So this whole group of 17,000 have been communicated about this in one way or another?
No, sir. We only send the email when we initiate.
Oh, when you get to the next person on the list.
We have notified all individuals of the request for documentation, or when they filed their PUA claim, we put on there, please provide us with documentation supporting the information that you provided. But now we are only communicating to them via email when we get to the point of doing the review, because we don't want to communicate with people that we don't need to.
Right. That goes back to the tax filter.
May, I did have some comments I wanted to present to the committee. This issue of the review of the PUA claims is obviously important, and in terms of the impact that it's going to have on Vermonters. And I think that going along with that, the co-issue of the overpayments that are going to come out of this, it's going to be a significant issue for Vermonters. And in February of this year, the federal government issued guidance to the states strongly urging that they waive no-fault, non-fraud overpayment, under unemployment overpayments. And we at Legal Aid have been urging the department to implement and announce blanket and individual waivers encouraged by the federal guidance as quickly as possible. We offered to help get the word out to our clients and the general public about waivers and how to apply for them. Some ALJs are routinely considering waivers, others do not. And unrepresented claimants are often not aware that they can request waivers. A group from Legal Aid met with Director Wood and Counsel Dirk Anderson in April of this year to discuss our serious concerns regarding the non-fraud overpayment situation and the unbearable stress and financial burden that these overpayments were having on Vermont families. And as I mentioned earlier, as of December 31st, 2021, VDOL reported to the U.S. Department of Labor that it had outstanding overpayments totaling more than $8 million. That number did not include any overpayments of the federal pandemic supplements of $600 or $300 a week, or the new federal pandemic benefit for self-employed and gig workers, the PUA benefit. So it did not include those. This is just UI overpayments that were outstanding as of the end of December 2021.
And what was that, Kelly?
More than $8 million. And then Director Wood in April of this year said that that was only the tip of the iceberg, that we were really going to be seeing huge numbers of overpayments coming down. And as we've discussed, people are now being asked to provide documentation of their employment or self-employment from over a year ago or more. At that time, the department rightfully sacrificed details in order to get out benefits when the need was dire as the pandemic flared. The department is now being forced by the federal government to go back and review every claim. The department should simultaneously be evaluating each claim for waiver of any overpayment resulting from claimants found to be ineligible after this review. In that way, notices could be issued that notified claimants of an overpayment and at the same time notified them that the overpayment had been waived. The current notice on the department's website tells people who received PUA that they could be subject to collections, offset of future UI benefits, loss of tax returns, legal action, future wage garnishments, but it makes no mention of the possibility that repayment could be waived or how to ask for a waiver. Families who received CARES Act unemployment benefits got money after they applied for and were told they were eligible for benefits. They relied on VDOL's determination that they were eligible and used the money they were sent for essential living expenses during the global pandemic. The financial and emotional impact of these overpayment notices coming years later for thousands or tens of thousands of dollars cannot be minimized. Likewise, adding millions of dollars of debt to the financial picture for Vermont workers and their families will adversely impact local and state economies. So for the sake of the whole state, Vermont Legal Aid is really urging the department to be acting as quickly as it can to remove this burden from Vermont workers by waiving non-fraud, no-fault CARES Act overpayments. And so while this review that is happening is certainly causing a lot of stress and is certainly a ton of work for the department, we believe the overpayment issue is far more significant for Vermont workers right now.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you have any other questions or.
What do you do in a case where there's no communication from the claimant? That's not considered a no-fault overpayment at that point?
I don't think we have an answer then. If there's no, that's a good question. What to do if we are certain that, but I guess that would be one question. Is there certainty that the claimant is receiving communication? Are we using correct method of communicating? If there's some way to show that the claimant was in receipt and just didn't bother to get back in touch with the department, I suppose that would be situation where the department might need to consider an overpayment.
I mean, I can see, for instance, if you were working with the department in terms of claimants that get to the last step and challenge or something, you might want to say, put in a self-addressed envelope with a pre-written attestation clause and let the person sign this and say, if you sign this under penalties of perjury or whatever, there will be no repayment. But sometimes it needs that degree of assistance to get the information out. I mean, some people might not have the skills to
or they don't
get the right information down. I mean, that may be one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, it says, send us an attestation clause proving that you were working. And someone said, what do I need to do? I don't know what I may not even know what the word attestation means.
Right.
There are examples in the document that DOL sends as to what kinds of pieces of paper are acceptable for this purpose, including letters, an affidavit from someone, statement from someone, copies of check. I mean, there's a very long list of ways in which people can do that. And one of my concerns goes back to the discussions that we had last year. We were considering the issue of fraud as to how to separate mistakes made by people that don't rise to that level, as opposed to the documented cases of people who are not out-of-state professional fraudsters, but people who are Vermont workers who on more than one occasion have sent in fabricated pieces of information in order to collect unemployment. And that the department has been able to document has been a problem in the past. And so it's separating those two kinds of issues that I think is going to be both important and perhaps difficult. But I would be very, very reluctant to grant some form of broad blank waiver that doesn't deal with situations where the state is being deliberately defrauded.
Those cases, I think Kelly was saying, were very modest. Of the 1,200, you said there were 6?
Well, this was again information from the end of 2021, the results of a public records request that we sent to the department. And it said that at the end of 2021, non-fraud overpayments were, there were 1,204 and there were 86 cases of fraud. So
yeah, pretty modest.
And the numbers and dollars
regarding the accuracy of the state's calculation as to what constitutes fraud and the measures in which the Department of Labor takes to identify fraud. That was one of the reasons why we requested again that consultant look at the extent of this problem.
And just to that point, Senator, the information that we report to USDOL as being quoted here is not going to distinguish between an actual identity theft case versus a fraud of somebody who is doing what we would call program fraud. There is no mechanism to identify those as separate in our USDOL reporting. And as was mentioned, the only thing we're reporting on is for regular UI at this point, not the other programs.
And you mentioned, I believe, also that this particular program has a much higher incidence of fraud than the regular UI program, in particular because of the way that people filed for claims initially, which produced that avalanche of claims that caused the electronic system to be turned off. So we're talking about two very different things statistically.
Damien, do you have anything you'd like to add? Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So what I would like, Cameron, is trying to get this in advance of the meeting, but I really like to just a memo of steps that are taken from the get-go, how a case is identified, or I guess every case is, PUA cases being looked at, and what the steps are. You know, it's almost like a flow chart with attachments if there's a boilerplate letter that goes out in one case or other instructions, some sort of manual maybe that's already exists that you give your caseworkers as to how they deal with this. It'd be good for us to see that, and then maybe we can stay in touch if we have further thoughts or offerings in terms of how to balance this. It's not an easy thing, I admit. And also, if you can get back to us on whether there's things like the tax department where things could be filtered out. You know, if someone's showing wages on a tax return, maybe you don't have to open that case. You know. So, and Kelly, do you have anything else you'd like to add at this point?
Just again to reinforce that in our view at Legal Aid, while we do appreciate the state's concern about fraud and certainly the department's mandate to look out for fraud, our experience with claimants coming through Legal Aid is that the overpayment situation and the burden that that is placing on regular workers is a much more significant problem facing folks right now. Obviously, people are not.
And you're suggesting that if in the workup they find an overpayment that's non-fraudulent, they could identify that as such, and in advance of that, they can ask the U.S. Department of Labor a waiver authority to waive anyone that they specifically find is non-fraudulent.
Actually, the USDOL has already issued that guidance. This February, there was an unemployment insurance program letter that came out identifying instances when blanket waivers or individual waivers can be granted, and it urged states to do that.
So I guess my question to Cameron is, given the fact that sort of started out not wanting to do that, and this is not your favorite choice, and you're not after getting back at people who were overpaid under these circumstances if it wasn't fraudulent, why wouldn't you take USDOL up on its offer?
I could suggest.
To be clear, there is a guidance letter that authorizes states to waive certain overpayments. I would not categorize it as a suggestion. There are many states who have no interest in waiving any overpayment.
And doing why I missed that.
There are some states that have no interest in waiving overpayments at all.
Right.
So I think USDOL does its best job to make sure it's providing guidance without recommending courses of action. There is a UIPL, as was mentioned, which authorizes states to waive certain non-fraud overpayments. It has to meet certain conditions. First off, it has to be a finding that the claimant is not at fault for the overpayment. So for starters, if it's the claimant's fault for the overpayment, you automatically can't waive it. And I'm here to tell you, based on our own data analysis using our internal reviews, more than the number as opposed to trying to quote it off the top of my head, 56% of our overpayment dollars in regular UI are due to claimant fault. Not department error, not employer fault, due to claimant fault. So if the overpayment is not at the claimant's fault and it would violate equity and good conscience to require repayment, the state has the authority to waive it. Now, this is just for CARES Act overpayments. This is PUC, the $600, the $300 additional benefit, and PUA. I believe at one point, 2 sessions ago, I don't think it was last session, there was a conversation about whether or not to add similar language in the underlying UI statute about whether or not to put a provision around waiver of overpayment. As a general matter, our practice in the past is not to waive overpayments in the regular UI program unless it's because of a department error. So what we have done as a department is we have taken that guidance and we have instituted procedures for our staff to say, if it meets these provisions, then you can waive them. In a lot of these instances, it's because we as a department consciously chose to do something that shouldn't be attributed to the claimant. There are certain blanket waiver provisions that USDOL has authorized to say, if you state have claimants that meet this criteria, you do not have to look at them individually. You can blanket waive every single one of them. A lot of people come to us and say, why aren't you using blanket waivers? The reality is they don't apply to the situations that are predominant here in Vermont. The blanket waiver scenarios that they have pre-authorized do not apply to us for whatever circumstance. So what we have done is we have asked staff to start to look at these. My staff should be providing notice on overpayments that include CARES Act dollars, identifying to the claimant how they can request a waiver of those overpayments. This is very difficult because on the one hand, we want to recognize there are claimants who were paid in the wrong program, for example, or for whatever reason because of a department determination. If you guys recall, we were waiving certain issues during the pandemic. USDOL wanted us to go back and re-adjudicate all of the A&A issues. Do you guys remember those conversations?
Yeah.
There are things that we don't want to address. That's what I was referring to earlier when I was talking about our communication back to USDOL. I don't want to waste my time, our staff's time, going through and reviewing some of these claims to put them in overpayment to then turn around and waive them. understand that we are also having to be held to our federal regulatory body, USDOL, where they tell us in writing, in procedure, or in guidance, you must establish overpayments where you identify them. So in some of these instances, we don't really have a choice. If we are able to identify certain claims are overpaid, we have to put them in overpayment. We also want to make sure we're distinguishing the ones that should be identified as fraudulent. I can tell you, for all of the claimants that we can come up with where it doesn't appear that it should be the claimant's fault and it's the bad department for coming after them, I can give you examples of people who were continuing to file in either UI or regular PUA while they were fully employed. So the people land on the entire spectrum, which I think the resultant team actually did a good job in the report of identifying. There is a long spectrum of where people land, and it is our job as a department to try to identify as best we can where they are. I can assure you, we're not interested in trying to go after every single person, but this is where we are pushing back on USDOL, because USDOL will tell us USDOL wants us to go in and do certain cross matches and review the tens of thousands of claimants that may come up and go in and rework those cases and identify which program they should have been in, if they should have filed in another state, etc., put them in overpayment and force them to do that. As a department, we don't really want to go through that exercise because we feel that it's a waste of the limited resources that we have. As I've mentioned a few times, what we would prefer to be doing is focusing on the current system, focusing on the people that are filing today, and making sure that we're going after and identifying the fraud as best as we can. So we at USDOL are in a very difficult circumstance when it comes to establishing overpayments and then identifying those that should be waived.
So disconnect I see here, it needs clarification. On one hand, Kelly's saying they're encouraging blanket waivers for non-fraud overpayments. And you're saying that's not the case. For instance, even if it's non-fraudulent, if the person made an error on their application resulting in overpayment, that can't be waived because it's the fault of the claimant, even though it's not fraudulent. So which one is it?
So there are overpayments that are not at the claimant's fault. There are overpayments that are at the claimant's fault that may not rise to the level of fraud,
Right.
And then there's fraud.
Right.
So if a claimant provides us incorrect information, it's hard to say that that's not on them for the overpayment. It may not be fraud, they may not have done it intentionally, but if somebody is not reporting correct information to us,
Look,
they may have misunderstood,
what
but
does the guidance say? Does it make that distinction, or does it just say as long as it wasn't fraudulent, you determine it's not fraudulent? You might take that case and say, I can't tell whether it's fraudulent or not, so I'm going to put it in the fraud category. But if you make the determination that it wasn't fraudulently done, that's what Kelly, are you familiar with the guidance she's talking about?
I have the guidance right here. I'm very familiar with it. I can walk through the blanket waiver scenarios if you want, for example, and show you why they don't apply to us. But just to take the individual cases, for example, the first determination that has to be made, and it's in the guidance. And to be clear, the guidance also very specifically says that the state shall put people in overpayment if you identify that they were not eligible, regardless of whether you waive it or not. The state shall place people in overpayment. If we identify that the overpayment was not the fault of the claimant, that's the first inquiry. If it is at the fault of the claimant, you cannot waive it. It doesn't matter if it's fraud or not. But if it's not the claimant's fault, I'll give you an example. We took claimants during the program and we automatically enrolled them onto the respective extension program. So you exhaust regular UI, you're eligible for PEUC, then PEUC tier 2, then tier 3. We automatically enrolled people into the next tier, sent them a notice that says, there's an extension. If if you are still eligible and continue to file, you can file for another 13 weeks, wherever the extension was. Now we're finding out that some of those people should have been stopped and either moved to another state, or they should have gone back to the beginning and filed another regular UI claim, okay? So that person is in overpayment now because they shouldn't have been continuing to file in the program that they were in. The first question we would look at is it the claimant's fault? Without any additional information, I would say it's not the claimant's fault because we as a department chose to move them into that program, okay? So now we have to establish the overpayment. Now we can look at waiver, not the claimant's fault. Second question, would it violate equity and good conscience to require the person to repay that amount? And that's where we have to look at things like what's their ability to repay? Is there an ability for them to go to a different program and offset benefits to then pay us back? That's the analysis that we have to go through.
Okay, so do you agree, Kelly, that, I mean, I'm hearing you say that the feds are encouraging a blanket waiver if there's no fault. And you're saying that no, that's not the case. If there is fault, it has to go overpayment status. At that point, it still could be. Let me just get an answer from you first.
Yeah, I think some of the issue has to do with the definition of fault. The department sometimes considers it fault if a person misreports their income, and they say, well, that's the claimant's fault that you receive pay on a bi-weekly basis or monthly, and you just divide it by 4 instead of.
But I didn't hear anything that you read that talked about fault. You just talked about fraud.
Right, but I'm saying that the department will say that that is the fault of the claimant. And if the claimant can show that there was no instruction to do anything differently, then it's not their fault. And we have had appeals like this at legal aid where the department has said, you misreported, that's your fault. And we have been able to show, actually, they did everything they were told to do accurately. There was no fault on this person's part. They saw the rules, interpreted them reasonably, gave a response that turned out to be incorrect. That's not fault. And my colleague wrote a letter, actually it's from the Unemployment Task Force at Legal Aid, dated in September 16th. And we sent the letter to the chair of the Employment Security Board, the current general counsel, and to the Jared Adler, staff attorney at Department of Labor. And in it, we explained that, and my colleague used the language that the U.S. Department of Labor strongly urges states to waive repayment where there is no fault and no fraud by the claimant.
Oh, wait a second. Now you're using the word fault.
Correct.
I thought you just said fraud.
Correct. No fault and no fraud.
Okay, so that explains Cameron. Let me ask you a question, Cameron. Is there any, it sounds to me like even if somebody was at fault, they would be entitled to try and get it waived. Is there any way you can merge that decision into one so that people, even though they're somehow, when they get their overpayment status, they get a notice of overpayment and said, based on all the information we've gathered, we waive the overpayment, as opposed to forcing them to appeal and going through another hearing or another review?
So in the past and currently, the department does not have a policy or a procedure to waive overpayments that are not due to the department's error for regular UI. When I took my position leading all the way up to the beginning of the pandemic, we as a department did not waive overpayments unless there was a determination that it was due to a department error. That's why when you see that $8 million number of outstanding UI claimant overpayments, I mean, that goes back, I don't even know how far back that goes to pull in all the overpayments that have been established over many, many years. The federal guidance that we're talking about here specifically applies to CARES Act programs And it specifically says that the state has two options. You can either review every overpayment at the time you establish the overpayment and address in the determination whether or not it should be waived, or you, state, can identify a single process by which people can apply for waiver of said overpayment. We chose the latter option primarily because that will allow us to better organize and identify how many we receive and how much we waive. Trying to think about the conversations around being able to provide you information when you need it, when you want access to it. We also did not want the application of the guidance that we issued to be inconsistent. So we did not want to give all of the staff the authority to waive overpayments, knowing that if we did so, we would likely come to some inequitable outcomes with some staff waiving everything and other staff members not waiving anything. Now, we can try to mitigate that by providing training to those individuals, but we felt that it would be best to go with the latter route and require people to apply for a waiver of an overpayment. Again, that way we can centralize the location of them, identify them, and ensure that we are providing consistent responses to those individuals when they request them. That's the method we chose to go.
I just want to do it.
Yeah, I've got my freeze.
Okay.
Cameron, I just remember, and I don't know if my number is correct, but I
Thanks,
just
David.
mentioned this number and see if it rings a bell with you.
Yes.
But we were looking at the sum total of improper payments from unemployment for the 10-year period beginning in 2010. Does the number $55 million ring a bell?
I remember us having a conversation, and I think that number was.
Because that was the
floated
number that I
discussed, yes, sir.
believe that we had of what the gross number, the total number of unemployment of improper payments, which includes both fraud, it also includes overpayments
Yes, sir.
in the unemployment system for that 10-year period. And that was a number that just leapt off the page for me.
I will say, Senator, I do believe that is accurate. I want to point to one thing in just speaking about circling back to how do you determine fault, not fault. So in our guidance to our staff, we pulled it directly out of the UIPL that USDOL issued, and I'll quote it real quick. We put in our guidance to our staff, the department does not have a formal definition of without fault. We don't have anything in our statute or our rules to define what is fault or without fault. However, quote, generally an individual is considered to be without fault when the individual provided all information correctly as requested by the state, but the state failed to take appropriate action with that information or took delayed action when determining eligibility, end quote. That's directly out of the USDOL guidance. So I understand that there are circumstances where a claimant may perceive to have provided correct information, but they didn't. And we provide them with a handbook. They attest that they've read it. We ask them questions on a weekly claim. I fully understand that some of this stuff is not easily understandable by the entire population, and we've directed our staff to take a look at that when it does occur.
I had hoped, and for the most part, we have confined this conversation to PUA, because that's the issue that brought us here. It's a special issue for fraud and for, there's likely to be more fraud, but there's likely to be a lot of innocent people that can't figure out what to do with this. I, for one, heard your arguments as to why you chose the direction of the two directions of how to do it. I think that's not really claimant friendly. And I think that I would encourage you to at least do that for the PUA cases that are before you, because there's going to be so many people who are going to be confused just because of the timing. They don't have the clear-cut direction to an employer. And the intent was for the federal government to cover all these people or independent contractors in the gig economy, all these. I just want to mitigate that, and we'll wait to get some of the information we asked for. And maybe the conversations could continue on before the session, but it seems like this issue is actually going to go on for a while at the pace you're
You have
going.
a tail, which is long.
If you're doing 5,000 out of 17,000 in 6 months, it'll be another year before you finish it.
And somewhere along the line, though, I would like to get as clear a delineation as we can as to what's fraud and what's, quote, error.
Yes, sir. I can tell you here, it is a challenge for the staff. I mean, you're trying to make a determination about a circumstance that potentially happened months ago, years ago, and this is standard practice. Again, this is what we do every day. It becomes very challenging for us as a department when you ask someone a question, well, why did you report your wages this way? And the answer is, I don't know. Well, I don't know is not a sufficient reason for you then not to be at fault for something, or for us potentially not to find fraud. If somebody's able to distinguish, well, I reported net instead of gross, which you're supposed to report gross, or I get paid on a monthly basis, so I divided it by 4.
But you clearly have instances where you have people who are not the people who are listed on the plan, and those are things that are identifiable and do in fact represent fraud. You also have the instances of the people who've been multiple repeat offenders within your system who have defrauded the system before. So, I mean, there are criteria that I think you can apply, certainly on a case-by-case basis, that fraud leaps off the page. And I'm just trying to get a sense for how big a problem is this? And particularly when you had the large-scale filing that caused you to shut down the electronic system. Those were presumably very heavily influenced by fraud.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. No,
And the question is, can the department just identify how big a problem we have and how much money is involved? Because I do not have a handle on how much money we're talking about, and that really concerns me.
I 100% agree with you, Senator. I will say it's just not, we will do our best to pull it together and then be able to provide the context like I was talking about earlier. This is my biggest concern when I start sharing those numbers in a committee, is because it's like you were just pointing out, what's fraud versus program fraud?
Well, that's the number today.
Right.
I'll accept even that much.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.